So it's a really great honour to be invited to contribute to this annual lecture series. I do have very fond memories of the first Sinclair Open Lecture, which was given by Professor Michael Halliday. This is the book of the lecture. I remember this particularly because he did not type this. He wrote it in longhand. And somebody, and I think it was me, had to sit and copy it onto a computer so that we could print this. The title of that lecture was intriguing. It was Judge Takes No Cap in Mid-Sentence. But the subtitle is more relevant to my lecture today. It was on the complementarity of grammar and lexis. And Professor Halliday emphasised the compatibility and the complementarity of his approach to language and the approach pioneered by Professor John Sinclair. And this is part of the theme that I will be pursuing today. And I'm beginning with a soothing picture of a forest. And I'm using this as a metaphor, this picture of a forest. So remember it. I'm going to be talking about people from different academic traditions who have different responses to and explanations of observed language phenomena. These people, I suggest, are working in different parts of the forest. In some cases, they're aware of each other and they talk to each other across the river. In other cases, the trees are too thick and they are simply unaware of each other's take on things. The work I'm talking about today tries to construct a donkey trail, an eco-friendly donkey trail, linking three parts of this particular forest. That's the problem with metaphors. You start to talk about forests and trails and then you think, hang on a minute, I don't want to drive a bulldozer through the forest, and you get all confused. So an eco-friendly trail. So I'm beginning with a current view of the structure of language. It's not the only current view, but it's one that I think will be familiar to the audience. It rejects the idea of language as syntax without meaning and lexis, which is meaning without structure. In its place, it is a view of language which talks about grammatical facts and lexical facts, but which sees the structure of language as more or less things that are a merger of grammar and lexis. For example, people talk about semi-fixed phrases or the patterning in how words are used, constructs that are a mixture of lexis and grammar, and mapping of form onto meaning. And to illustrate this, I've got a little made-up example based on fictional characters, nobody real. I'm very grateful to a visiting student from China, and it is very often the insights of people who are coming to this kind of work new. Very grateful for the insight in drawing my attention to this example such as this, which the visitor found unusual. And what struck me was that, in a sense, it's not at all unusual. It's a perfectly ordinary thing to say. And also, when you start to think about it, it is actually rather odd. So the visiting student asked, come to terms with is used with things that are negative. This is used with success. How can that be? And we start to construct all sorts of stories about Joe and Mary, whose relationship would seem to be not unproblematic. So anyway, come to terms with a fixed phrase or a multi-word unit. It's open to some variation. The word come can become coming, came, but the base form is the most frequent form, and the base form is, I read this out, proportionally much more frequent in this phrase than the verb come is found in other contexts. You will have to take my word for that. It just is, right? And I'm using what Sinclair does, which is to talk about the typical as meaning there's a lot more of it, but I'm not going to bother with the actual numbers, right? So typically, what comes before it is things like modals, adjectives such as hard or difficult, indications of coercion such as force, or of assistance such as help. And these are the examples of the typical things that come after it: loss, the past, success, and identity. And this is how we might interpret the meaning. The things that come before it indicate an action that is both necessary and difficult. The things that come after might be described as evaluatively negative, but that doesn't work really with success or with identity. You can see on the right how I've accounted for the presence of the item in this context. I've suggested it's all about change, a change in circumstance such as loss, a change in perception, how you see the past. And I haven't tested this out. I offer it as a suggestion for somebody else to do. I suspect there's been a development in how the phrase is used from the use with obviously negative things such as loss to things which are not negative but do require a level of adjustment that might be difficult to achieve, such as having a new identity. You'll recognise a link with semantic prosody. The past here is interpreted as meaning the past in which something bad happened, and we can make up a complex story about why the success of the latest record might be difficult for somebody to come to terms with, fame, success, etc., for a sensitive soul. But we do that interpreting only because of the presence of the phrase come to terms with. So I come back to the aim of building connections between different parts of the forest, different perspectives on what it is that linguists do. And I'll start with a nice forest picture for systemic functional grammar, developed by Halliday and others. This interprets language as a social phenomenon. A language construes the physical and the social world through a series of oppositions or choices. For example, in English, we can represent a weather event as a series of actions. The wind blew, it rained, or as an entity, a storm with a duration, lasted 3 hours. We can choose a phrase such as come to terms with, implying an attitudinal meaning, or we can make a more neutral choice, such as adjust to. The choices between examples A and B focus on the grammatical, and they're very similar to Halliday's work on grammatical metaphor. And the choices between examples C and D focus on the lexical, and are more similar to Hassan's work on lexical networks. And put together, they suggest one view of the linguist's job, to work out the best way of modelling these alternatives. Now we have a beautiful bamboo forest, and we turn to construction grammar, discussed by Langachter, Hilpert, Croft, Goldberg, and others. It looks as language as a mental phenomenon existing in some form in the brain of the language user. So, according to these linguists, language consists of constructions, which are mappings of form and meaning. Each construction has a single form and a single meaning. As we learn or acquire or develop language ability, what we're doing is learning constructions. One such construction might be come to terms with. And this suggests a very different view of the linguist's job. It's to work out the best way of modelling what language users have in the brain. And I'm actually grateful to David Adger for suggesting that formulation. He didn't know he was helping me out at the time, but I'm still grateful to him. Now, a somewhat misty, foggy, and impenetrable forest, which is corpus linguistics, in the particular version pioneered by John Sinclair, brackets, other versions are available. So according to Sinclair, language description should be based primarily on lexis rather than on grammar. Each word has a unique set of behaviours. He suggested that a great deal of language consists of units of meaning, of which come to terms with as a possible example. Meaning resides in these phrases rather than in individual words. He added that what we call grammar is an abstraction or a set of generalizations from millions of instances. And we might say that the job of the linguist is to work out the best way of modeling the patterning in a language. Just a little example. Sinclair, as we know, as Michaela said, developed his ideas while leading work on the COBIL dictionaries. One of the innovations in the dictionary, as far as I know, not ever copied in any other learner's dictionary, was the way that the definitions were written, designed to reflect the usage or patterning of the word. So here's the definition of one of the meanings of consider. If you consider a person or thing to be something, the bold type shows the head word, and the structure of the definition shows how the word is used. Consider something to be something. Actually, as Sinclair became more convinced of the value of units of meaning, he actually wanted to change the way that these definitions were presented in the dictionary. And he wanted something, I think, like this, where the bold would encompass the whole of the unit of meaning. You consider a person or thing to be something, all in bold. And what lay behind that, I think, was that he wanted to say the unit of meaning, A considers B to be C, means that A has the opinion that B is C. He didn't get his way with that, incidentally. Another of the innovations in the dictionary, pioneered by Jill Francis, and this is moving from lexis to grammar. It was the invention of grammar patterns. These record the behaviour of each word from a grammar-only perspective. They avoid traditional terms like subject, object, and complement, and they show a sequence of clause or phrase types. So we've got here, consider a person or thing to be something. There is a pattern, verb, noun to infinitive, consider our customers to be friends. There's a pattern, verb, noun, noun, consider myself a strong, competent woman. The pattern, verb, noun as adjective, consider weightlifting as unnatural. Sometimes I think these examples were chosen with a kind of autobiographical, or verb followed by that clause, considers that pet shops are very unfair. And if we look at the other senses of consider, we've got other patterns there as well. So grammar patterns give less information than the units of meaning do, but they're more generalizable. And the second part of Jill Francis's project exploited this by collecting all the words with the same pattern, for example, verb, noun to infinitive, and put them all together. And one of the groups of words with this pattern is this one with our word consider in it. And I had the privilege of working with Jill and with Elizabeth Manning on both the COBIL dictionary that was published in 1995 and the 2 pattern grammar books that came out of it. If Sinclair's work can be summarised as lexis first, then grammar, Halliday's could be summarised as from grammar to lexis. And these are quotes from the book I showed you earlier from the lecture given in 2001. And he talks about grammar taking over the whole of lexicogrammar. And he said this was the grammarian's dream, was to take over the whole of this territory, reducing all lexis to grammar. And then he added, because he was giving the Sinclair lecture after all, the lexicographer's dream is to reduce all grammar to lexis. But he also talked about the notion of complementarity, as I have already said, and this is a notion that I am drawing on quite a lot. So in summary, we've got a social view, we've got a cognitive view, and we've got a corpus view. And these are the 3 things I'm trying to bring together. The social view and the corpus view complementarities have been proposed by Halliday. The corpus view and the cognitive view, until recently, I think compatibilities were largely ignored, although that is very much changing. All of which brings me to the project that I'm going to be describing today. It's an attempt, as I keep saying, to drive past through the forest, and it consists of 2 stages. Using the pattern grammar resources, I derive a comprehensive, I say comprehensive, it's sort of comprehensive, set of verb argument constructions for English. And using these constructions, I derive system networks related to specific meanings. The project draws on a lot of influences, obviously Sinclair, Francis, Halliday, Goldberg, which is how I encountered construction grammar, but also Patrick Hank's work on the Pattern Dictionary of English Verbs, Hassan's work on Lexis as Delicate Grammar, the work on FrameNet, including by my colleagues Amanda and Florent, and the work of Barnbrook and Birmingham alumnus Sue Hang on local grammar. I'm not going to go into detail on all of those influences, but you may see trails of them as we go through. This is the progress so far. I've worked on 50 verb patterns, which is just about all of them. And from the 50 patterns, I have identified about 750 constructions. I am not going to go through all 750 constructions. I'm now embarked on stage 2, and I've derived some system networks and will be doing some more. I'd like to acknowledge the contribution from Leverhulme, who are funding the project, the research assistant, Abby Ip, and wonderful University of Birmingham website developers, Karis and Nafraz, who have done wonderful work on the website. And that's the homepage, just to show it exists. And you'll notice the catchy title of the project, Conceptualizing Transitivity Networks Through Pattern-Based Constructions. And this is the argument I want to make. You don't have to memorize it, because I'll be coming back to it as we proceed. But that's where it is. So to make this argument, I'm going to track the progress of a single example, and I've taken this from the Bohr corpus, so I've no idea who wrote it, but it's a student who was writing an essay that ended up in the academic English corpus. Wundt described principles of psychology as beautiful literature, but not psychology. I have no idea whether that's controversial. I have no opinion on this subject myself whatsoever. We can look at this example from the point of view of pattern, construction, or functional systems. The pattern is verb, noun, as noun, and describe is one of 137 verbs attested with this pattern in the Cobill Dictionary. The usage has been identified as a construction by Gries et al. They call it the as predicative construction, and they say that it has 3 slots, a complex transitive verb, the word as, and a predicative complement, usually denoting a property. And they say that the meaning is not derivable from the constituents. And as functional systems go, it would be a verbal process kind of overlapping with a material process, and in relation to Martin and White's work, it would be said to open up dialogic space. So, back to the argument. The first point made is that it's possible to reinterpret the information from pattern grammar as constructions. So we start from the information in the pattern grammar verb book and rework the groups of verbs as constructions. So here's part of the entry in the database for the construction instantiated in our example. And this is a replication of what's on the website. You can see that the table shows the pattern, it shows the construction name, it's got a number, it's number 4 of 10 that come from this pattern. The construction name borrows one of the verbs in the list. There's a description of it, there is a list of verbs, and there's an example that in this case comes from the BNC. You'll note that the construction description is not particularly construction-y. It's not as technical as the one I quoted from Gries et al. On the previous slide. The same goes for the construction name, which simply picks up one of the verbs from the list. Someone from the construction grammar part of the Forest could rework this and make it more technical, but I think the accessibility of it is actually quite nice. The list of verbs is not identical to any of the list of verbs in the pattern grammar book. It's a selection and reworking from those verbs. Thirdly, you'll notice that there's no quantitative information here. Ideally, I would be able to replicate the work of Stefanovic and Gries and show the collostruction, which verbs occur most frequently in this construction compared with the other verbs and compared with the other constructions that those verbs appear in. This is beyond my competence, but the information is here for anybody who would like to take that on. They have my blessing to do that. So the next part of the argument is that these constructions are best presented as a network, not as a list. So there's an entry for each of the 750 constructions that I've just shown you. But the idea for networks is, of course, an influence from Halliday and systemics. So here is the verb noun as noun network that replicates how it appears on the website. There are 10 constructions with describe something as at number 4. The constructions are divided according to process type, again broadly based on Halliday. So we have cognition meanings, we have communication meanings, action meanings, and a relational meaning. So somebody thinks something, says something, does something, or two things relate to each other. This is more detail on the cognition part of the network, showing that the distinctions here between constructions are based on form, specifically what the subject is. And I've given examples to show this. So the perceiver as subject, as in they saw Ted as a loser, the evidence as subject, the bronze shield marked him as an alumnus, or the perceived thing as subject, he doesn't strike me as a megalomaniac. So there are 3 constructions with the same pattern but different configurations that are brought together under the heading of cognition because of what they mean. It would be possible to set that out differently. That's the way I'm proposing. When it comes to communication, the distinctions are ones of meaning rather than form. So it's proposed here that describe, where it's sort of neutral reporting, is differentiated from condemn and praise, where there is an evaluation, and also differentiated from the meanings to do with caricature, where the reporter is saying this was an opinion and the opinion was wrong. And we can use this to illustrate the possibility of constructions of a very different level of generality. In construction grammar, there are more general and more specific constructions. So we could say that there was a verb noun as noun communicate construction. A person communicates entity as entity. But we can then come down to be more specific, a neutral report construction, an evaluative report construction, and a reporter evaluates construction. This particular pattern is fairly straightforward. There aren't many choices. There aren't many different things you can do with the pattern. So just to show off a bit, here's another example. And this is the verb noun into noun network. You can see there are more levels to the network. You probably can't see much else because it's pretty difficult pretty difficult to read. There are 18 numbered constructions in this pattern. Here's part of the pattern that's part of the network that's more legible. It shows the primary division in the constructions between those that mean change something into something, and those that mean cause, make somebody do something into an action. The 8 constructions in the cause to do branch there, so if I go back, so there's change is divided into transform, merge and divide, and causation is divided into cause to do and cause to be, and they've all got the pattern verb, noun into noun. This is the cause to do divided into force and deception and encouragement, and the force is divided according, again, to process types. Communication, talk somebody into an unwise action. The action, pressure somebody into an unwise action. And emotion, for example, intimidate someone into an unwise action. In the database where these are recorded, there are notes that explain the distinctions that have been made, and this is a kind of representation. So you're told, when you look at cause to do, the constructions are divided according to whether the verbs indicate force, deception or encouragement, and if you look at deception, it says it's divided according to whether the affect of positive or negative. So the thinking behind the networks is kind of explained there. So far, so good. So what's next? Well, thinking about the construction networks has helped to make clear the kinds of meaning that each construction makes. To go back to our principles of psychology example, we could say that this construction instantiates 2 things. It makes a meaning of communication. Somebody describes something in a particular way. But it also makes a meaning of having an identity. The book is literature, according to Wundt. And bearing in mind about what Halliday said about complementarity, the great news is we don't have to choose between the 2. We can label the construction as communication and as giving an identity. We can also specify the semantic role of each part of the construction. And this makes it a little bit similar to the work of Hanks, Fillmore, and Patton and Perec. But the specific role depends on the meaning perspective. So again, here's our example. Viewed as communication, and again I'm drawing on Halliday and Matheson's terminology here, we have a sayer and we have a message. And I've added here that the message tells us what a particular state is. But at the same time, we have the name of the book, which in Halliday and Matheson's term is the carrier, and literature, not psychology, is an attribute. So this information can now be added to the little box that tells us about the construction. So within each construction, as well as the name and the description and the verbs and the example, we can say that we have a semantic field of communication, and within that, the first noun phrase is the sayer, and the second and third noun phrases added together are the message. If you look at the semantic field of what I'm calling carrier attribute, then you have a sayer and a carrier and an attribute. Which brings me to the next part of the argument. It's possible to build the constructions into system networks, showing alternative meanings in the same semantic field. So now we're moving from our list of constructions into systemic functional grammar. So the process, how this is done, is you look at every construction in every pattern, 750 of the blooming things, and you identify those that belong to the particular semantic field that you're interested in. So if we take communication As an example, constructions expressing this meaning occur in 29 patterns, including, of course, the verb noun as noun pattern that we were looking at. And there are over 100 such constructions. So the task then is to create a network that models how those constructions relate to each other and what forms and meanings the speaker chooses between. It's important to acknowledge, of course, that the speaker does not actually choose any more than Halliday meant that speakers choose between the different branches of the networks that he set up. Rather, these are alternative expressions that are available to the language community. The second thing to note is that the network is only a proposed model. There's no actual evidence for it. Somebody else could come up with different networks, but this is my suggested ones. So as you might expect, a network taking account of 100 ways of talking about something is quite complex, so I'm going to show only part of it. Here's the leftmost part of the network. This is how you do communication, or rather how you talk about somebody doing communication. It shows a primary division between language and paralanguage. And paralanguage is things like shoot someone a glance or signal to someone, and it has only a few constructions in it. The major choice is the language one, talking about talking or writing or signing. And here the main division is between an exchange of information and an exchange of actions or goods and services. And this reflects, of course, the distinctions proposed by Halliday. Within each of these, there are two options. You give or elicit information, you direct somebody to do an action, or commit oneself to do an action. And we're going to follow up the give information option. So these are the options within give information. The basis for the division is largely formal. The first division relates to how the information is expressed. Is it a more or less full message, or as in a that clause, or is it just the topic? For example, he complained about the poor service. We don't know what he actually said, just that it was about the poor service. Is it meta-language? For example, she read them a story. Or is there actually no content at all, as in she shouted at him? Looking only at the with message branch, that's the only one I've shown here. All the others have branches that come off, but screens are only so big. So if we look at only the with message, there are the predictable choices between with and without hearer. That is the hearer appear in the clause. Looking only at without hearer, we divide between with target and without target. The difference is between giving information, for example, she described walking somewhere, and saying something about somebody. She described him as an idiot. All the branches of the network have more detail that's not shown here, and all end up with a set of patterns. I'm only showing one of those routes and the 6 patterns associated with it. And here we see more detail of the constructions that form this part of the network, with our sample sentence describing something as something, an instance of the construction in blue there. And remember, incidentally, that each of those constructions also has lots and lots of verbs in it, so it'd be even smaller and smaller concepts. So to the final stages of the argument, our example construction forms part of another meaning network too. At the moment, I'm calling this a carrier attribute network, reflecting the participant roles in relational processes identified by Halliday. I'm not entirely happy with that term but the other ones I've thought of, I'm not entirely happy with either, so it's sticking for the moment. So the basic meaning of this semantic field is that something is or becomes or seems something. It has a property, identity, or quality. But I include in this network identities and properties and qualities that come about as a result of change, or they're caused by something else, and they are said or thought to exist. So there are 27 patterns that express this meaning, and these have been reinterpreted as 132 constructions. So to show the kind of thing I mean, here are some examples of something is something. The sea looked green, the stars shone bright, he remains a bachelor, he came across as honest, they dressed like teenagers. Adding to that something changes to something, the crowd divided into two mobs, she progressed to head teacher, the engine developed a fault. So we've got here the patterns divided into two mobs, verb into noun, progress to head teacher, verb to noun, or develop to fault, verb, noun. Causing something to become something, she translated the book into Latin, verb, noun into noun. It flooded the area with light, verb, noun with noun. He cut the bread into slices, verb, noun, you get the thing. He appointed her foreign secretary, or he wiped the slate clean. And saying and thinking, he likes his coffee hot. She called him a fool. They estimated the value at £10. She mistook him for her husband, and he described it as an error in judgment. I don't think there's not supposed to be a little story going through that. You can make one up if you really like. So these are the sorts of constructions that are going into this network. Here's the leftmost part of the proposed network, making the primary distinction between it is construed at, that is, somebody says or thinks something is a particular thing, or it changes to become. And here is part only of the construal branch, showing communication and cognition as two of the choices. Within communication, I suggest that the construal can be unmarked, less evaluative, or marked, more evaluative. And in the unmarked branch, there are three constructions, there are three patterns and four constructions. Call somebody something, call somebody a quality, profess oneself a quality, or describe something as a quality or an identity or a property. One of the important points to make here is that the network is not actually pattern-driven, as it were. So this is a network of meanings, a network of constructions, not a network of patterns. What this means is that the pattern doesn't only occur in one place. So if you take the verb noun as noun pattern here, with our construction number 4, describe something as we had in our wouldn't describe the principles of psychology as beautiful literature, that verb noun as noun pattern will occur in other places in the network with different constructions attached to it. So, that briefly, although now I think about it maybe not so briefly, that briefly is the current stage of the project. And this is what the journey so far looks like. We started with Sinclair's vision of the centrality of lexis in the description of a language and the detail of usage around that lexis. That vision was realised in the lexicography that resulted in the CoBuild publications. They were not just dictionaries, they were a whole new way of describing how English works. And then came the work of Jill Francis and the generalizations about grammar that were based on the observation of pattern and its connection to meaning. From that background, the contribution of this project has been to reinterpret those patterns as constructions and to produce a usable database of around 750 verb argument constructions. Inspired by the work of Halliday, system networks have been used to express hierarchies of constructions. The next step was to identify semantic fields, again inspired by Halliday's approach, and to identify the constructions that express those fields. And finally, to derive system networks for selected semantic fields. In short, the project has linked pattern grammar to construction grammar, linking Sinclair's view of grammar to construction grammar, and it has linked construction grammar to systemic functional grammar. So it's done something around those three little circles. What about the future? Well, this is definitely not my future, I'm telling you that, but it might be somebody else's. It would be possible to do the same thing, and I do hope really I don't get involved in doing this. It would be possible to do the same thing for the patterns connected with nouns and with adjectives. The good news is it would be less work because there aren't as many patterns. So it would be actually easier to do, I say. It may be possible to derive new learner resources, to use the constructions database to form the basis of a resource for learners that would fulfill Sinclair's dream of a dictionary of units and meaning, going from meaning to constructions. And possibly it will be of interest to those working with the Lexis end of the lexicogrammar. So I leave you where we started with our nice soothing picture, and thank you very much for your attention.